It's the last speaker session. We're going to have a round table after this, but we're coming towards the end of the day. And I'm delighted to introduce Professor Sylvia Hurtado from UCLA, an extremely distinguished speaker. She's a professor at the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information. She served as director of the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA for more than a decade. She's a member of the National Academy of Education. And she's published widely and prominently on lots of topics that are relevant to today's conference. Topics such as campus climate, the experiences of underrepresented identity groups in college, and diversity in higher education in general. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Professor Hurtado.
Thank you. This is great. This is amazing. I think we could get even this many people at UCLA on a Friday afternoon. So thank you for staying here till the very end and to hear the final closing. But I'm going to talk today a little bit about actually some of the newer work that I'm doing. Thank you very much. And so I want to talk a little bit about mentorship, and it came up a couple of times today. Several people have mentioned it. The students mentioned it. And so some of these things have actually happened in a more informal way. I'm going to start by really talking about mentorship as a way to kind of deepen our commitment in terms of teaching. So there's a lot of parallels between teaching and mentoring. As you know, the movement in teaching in terms of what we've learned in the last couple of decades has been amazing, and I think similarly we're seeing a similar kind of what I call blossoming of scholarship and attention and renewed focus on mentorship as an important way to achieve the goals of educating the next generation, but also for particular jobs. In this case, the main focus has been, particularly of the National Institutes of Health, has been on research, to be able to produce a next generation of researchers. And so typically mentorship has been much more of the informal kind, but now we're moving into understanding both the research in terms of its developments and also beginning to talk about evidence-based practice in mentorship in the same way we've been talking about in teaching today. So another component of that is really thinking about mentorship as part of academic quality or program quality. External reviews of several departments and particular programs have been the extent to which students, not only that students have been successful in their career achievements after college, graduate and undergraduate, but also what kinds of advising or mentorship kinds of activities are going on within the institution. So that's becoming part of program review and conversation. Another component, of course, is very much like faculty development and teaching, is that we're now beginning to talk about faculty development in terms of mentorship. And I want to really stress that one of the things that I'm going to be talking about a national report that I was part of, that mentorship is a learnable skill. In other words, in the same way, because, teaching, we thought, well, we all do it. What's the deal, right? Well, now we know, of course, it's a learnable skill. Things can be improved. There are notions of quality assessment we need to take into account. The same way we're finding that in mentorship. And then thinking about a lot of the research that, I won't present today, but it's going to be part of a report, and I'm going to give you all these resources because it's an amazing report that just came out from the National Academy, is really that it's linked to outcomes, including some long-term career kinds of outcomes. As I like to tell my graduate students is that I'm always your advisor. So what I mean is really mentor, but I don't usually use a mentor, but, and they kind of think, well, we're done, after they graduate. But no, we're still in conversation. I'm helping them through transitions in their career. So in some ways, we've kind of instituted this part of what we do without a lot of visibility or even ways of documenting. And I'm going to say that's changing in terms of what we're doing. A final component I do want to say something about, and that's the accountability for improvement. In the same way that teaching has been difficult to really put accountability into the process, to understand, though for particular institutions, teaching and its review of quality has been much more systematic. I think in mentorship we have not really implemented as much of the accountability mechanisms as we can in the same way. And the question is, whose responsibility? Of course, I'll come to our recommendations at the end of this. So let me go ahead and start with this report. We focused in the STEM fields because that's what the National Academy of Science does for the most part. But really, it's probably one of the most comprehensive reports you're going to get about the research on mentorship today. So it's free, it's downloadable. I'll have the link. But if you go just to the National Academy Press website and just look up this report, you can download it for free. And I want to say another component of what we did as a consensus panel of experts to produce the report, that we actually have now an online component that has a ton of resources. So I'm going to allude to some of the tools, some of the things that actually are in that online resource guide. But for the most part, a lot of the details will be there. So I'm going to talk about some of the highlights of this report. And I want to say that I am starting a new 5-year study on looking at mentorship at the graduate level and research institutions. And so I'm in the middle of a bit large project like that. And so I won't be able to share any findings like today that we have several people sharing the preliminary findings from some of their projects. But I want to focus on this report because it provides a good foundation and background for understanding all the work that's going on in mentorship. And I do want to say the National Institutes of Health is invested in a huge way as a way to kind of, as I said, produce the next generation of scholars, but also to look at equity issues in terms of women and underrepresented groups, in terms of their representation, and the notion that mentorship opportunities are not equally distributed, or actually the qualities, there's variation in quality, is something that they're very concerned with. So they've invested in a huge way. One of the ways they've invested is certainly the National Research Mentoring Network that they helped launch. That entire network is now converting into primarily research on mentorship and funded research and connecting ways with instruments, measurements, all those kinds of things. But I want to say this report brings together multiple disciplinary perspectives. So although it focuses on STEM, of course we pulled from organizational psychology, social psychology, education, and a lot of the discipline-based education and research that's coming out now related to mentorship. It does provide guidance on effective behaviors. There's a whole section on theoretical frameworks, measures and assessment, mentoring tools, and of course the role of institutional support. What does it mean in terms of how do we foster this? How do we ensure that quality mentoring is going on? So I want to give a nod to the committee. It was chaired by Angela Byers-Winston at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the medical school, but certainly the people in this group were amazing, and they're doing amazing work in a variety of fields. And so it was great to actually work together. I've been on like 4 National Academy Press major reports now, and this was probably the most fun. And I think because we were so engaged and we felt we were breaking some new ground here, because in the past, mentorship is really well, yeah, that it happens, it's important, but not really thinking about it as a science. And so this was a really important thing for us to do. Those were our funders, the National Academy does congressionally mandated reports. This was not congressionally mandated, so it came from, basically we got the charge from the Board of Higher Education and Work, which is part of the National Research Council and National Academy. And the statement as task was to conduct a study of STEM mentoring programs and practices at the undergraduate and graduate level. And over the course of the study, the way it was conducted is we had 18 listening sessions across the country, university campuses, major professional meetings. There were about 3 lit reviews, and then we did public workshops where I invited key people that had been doing research on this area across the country to come and talk about what are the main issues, to share some of the state-of-the-art of research. And then, in addition to the final report, we were tasked to create this online guide. So it was probably the first report that has this now online guide for institutions, departments, and individuals. so they can go and see the resources. So let me start with what is mentorship. We found that different papers, different researchers, they all had slightly different definitions. So as a committee, we kind of struggled with this and finally came down with mentorship is a professional working alliance in which individuals work together over time to support the personal and professional growth, development, and success of the relational partners through the provision of career and psychosocial support. That's a mouthful. What I will say is, what's distinct about this is we were talking about it as more an exchange. Now, we do acknowledge there's hierarchy in mentoring relationships very often in terms of novice versus expertise, in terms of career differences, etc. But we're also moving into an area where I call more dialogic mentoring, where we have professionals like, faculty helping other faculty to learn more about the things that are important in terms of teaching and mentorship. So I think that's really key, is really to think about it as much more of an exchange. And the mentorship involves at least 2, well, in some areas there's 5, depending on how you look at it, but career support functions, guidance, skill development, sponsorship, and then psychosocial support functions. And so that's emotional support, role modeling, understanding how to navigate political systems in their environment, particularly in academia, I think is really important, all aimed at talent development. So I just want to say that the notion of mentorship then complements other developmental processes, including teaching and learning, coaching, in terms of developing knowledge and skills, and kind of the holistic development of the individuals and including their own identity, and in this case as scientific researchers. So, all right, so what is mentorship? Here are some key elements that have come out of the literature. One involves trust, and that's why the commitment is deeper to a certain extent. This trust develops between mentors and mentees in terms of working together to respond to mutual goals, needs, priorities, and this can change over time. And I'll talk about the stages in a little bit. Another component is self-reflection. That is, critical and honest self-reflection occurs at multiple stages of effective mentorship processes. That is, where are we, what's needed, how do you aspire, how are you making progress toward your professional goals. All of that is very important, but actually we're now getting people to write these things down in terms of sharing those, particularly when it comes to expectations. So for mentors and mentees to be more explicit at the initiation of the relationship, revisit it periodically, and record it in writing to create more effective mentoring relationships. So there are some tools now to create those clearer expectations between mentor and mentee. Some institutions are adopting them widespread, and so there'll be some of those tools online for you to take a look at. And then, of course, I want to reemphasize that mentorship is a learned skill. Is that, because we all do it, or we all do teaching, we think we know it. Well, there's a lot of components to it, and I've been working with students for decades. I have probably over 50 graduates that are all over the country. And I have to say that my involvement in this has really made me kind of rethink how I am and what I do as a mentor. So I think it's been very useful to be able to have this conversation. All right, so there are a variety of stages, so some of you may be aware of, and when I told my students, I'm kind of your mentor for life, because whenever you're going to change careers, you're going to go from associate to full, you're going to move institutions or whatever, you're going to come back and we're going to have a conversation. And so I think my students come to expect it, but some of them don't realize that's the case initially when we start. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the starting process, because I think that's also very difficult, because sometimes we don't exactly choose each other, or we don't know enough about each other when we do this. But anyway, so the initiation stage, there's cultivating the relationship. There's then separation, that when students graduate, they go on and do wonderful things. And then the relationship is redefined. And so I want to say that's really part of what happens. So it's kind of ongoing, it's long-term. in terms of responding to needs and goals and priorities of, my own needs as a mentor, but also the needs of the mentees. So I want to start with also maybe shattering a little bit of maybe your thinking, perhaps, and maybe you know this, is that we really think of dyads. We think of the mentor-mentee one-on-one. But really what we're finding, particularly in literature and research, people are now looking at this notion of, for example, the collective or group, like research labs, for example. They might have 2 mentors and they might have 3 mentees, postdoc, graduate student, undergrad. So they have people at various levels. So it's more of a collective group. And there's mentoring going on between mentees and between mentors and mentees. There's also the notion of triads, where they can be 2 mentors and 1 mentee, or multiple mentors, actually. And then also we have the, or 2 mentees and 1 faculty member, but of course, the triads. So people have been studying these different structural relationships. The third one is really thinking about mentoring as a social network. So that's another component, because now we think of not just the mentee, but we think about the mentor's resources and links with other mentors and their mentees. I think it was really interesting, the National Repository for Dissertations, they're beginning to map out who has chaired someone's dissertation and who their students have chaired. So there's there's these lineage studies that are pretty amazing to sort of see how that process, and this happens in various disciplines. So I thought that was really cool to really think about this as more of a social network. So the standard that we think is the personal one-on-one, yes, that happens, but now we're looking at configurations and structures that help us determine more about how widespread it is and how it's being implemented. So another component is there is some research, by the way, on negative mentoring experiences. Not a lot of it in the STEM field, but really primarily I think this comes from more organizational behavior and human resource studies, is that the notion of that there are deleterious effects when the mentorship is not effective, when the mentor-mentee relationship is not working. When mentors are absent, they are unrealistic about their expectations. They don't provide clear and relevant guidance. We heard a lot about that today in terms of some of the online work, just in terms of laying that out in teaching. The same is true in mentorship. They may engage in manipulative behavior by delegating inappropriate work to the mentee or taking credit for the mentee's work. So a lot of negative mentoring experiences may also arise from otherwise good intentions. That the relationships vary. And so one of the things they're understanding is that there are consequences to some of these relationships. Okay, so how do diverse identities affect mentorship? Well, I want to say something that I get that question also in the STEM fields. It's like, well, how is diversity relevant to STEM? And certainly, I always say, well, your classroom is diverse. What you do in terms of relationship to students is really important. And so the issue is people come to these relationships with their own identity. There are multiple social identities. And as instructors and mentors, we also perform our identity, even though we may not be aware of it. So they can see our multiple social identities as well. So a lot of the work now that's being done, and some of the work we're doing on culturally aware mentoring, is that now we're actually taking into account the various social identities that come into the mentor-mentee relationship. These are empirically linked with academic and career development and a whole range of other things. Now, I do want to say something about matching. Because of groups that are severely underrepresented, we don't have matches for the mentor. That means we have a lot of cross-race, cross-gender mentoring going on. And for the most part, none of us would be here. Some of us would not be here, especially me, if those cross-race mentoring relationships were not successful. In other words, so they can be very successful. So the research doesn't definitively say anything that they must be of the same race or gender, but people get different things from those relationships when they do match, and when they don't match. So there's a lot more research that actually has to happen in this. But for the most part, I think the key thing is really thinking about in these multiple identities where students feel they're being othered or they don't belong or they have difficulty achieving their career identity and science identity could be as a result of this kind of inclusion. And we've gathered a lot of stories, particularly from graduate students, on how this happens in STEM fields. All right. So culturally responsive mentoring is also a learned skill in which mentors, regardless of race or gender, show interest and value students' cultural backgrounds and social identities. It may help students navigate invalidating experiences in academia, affirm belonging in STEM contexts, and reinforce the belief in their own ability to be successful. There is some research that mentors without access to culturally responsive mentoring can experience some identity interference, which can result in depression, reduced psychological well-being, lower academic professional performance, but very often it's because they are being excluded in various ways in professional kinds of settings, because this is certainly not working. That is, the mentor-mentee relationship is not working, and the expectation is that you will leave your social identities behind when you come into these relationships. Well, one's identity is part of who they are. It's not like a robe or a lab coat where you drop it and you're going to be a scientist, for example. Basically we're just trying to make both the mentor and the mentee aware of how those social identities might be in play in their relationship. So how does disciplinary context affect mentorship? We're finding a lot of the research on mentorship, particularly in STEM, has been in the context of research. So the primary research mentor, a lot of this has been more formal in terms of supervisory or evaluative roles, in terms of formal assignments, for example. But what we found that students and faculty often enter the relationships based on mutual interest and respect. That is, the informal is very important in terms of how they develop. But we found also the mentees occasionally choose research advisors based on real scant information, that there's not a lot of information there. And even when, for example, if you're in the middle of recruiting graduate students now, people are getting to know each other and they say, well, is this going to work? Is this where I should be? And then not all mentees and research advisors consider the relationship to be a mentoring relationship. So programmatic ones, for the most part, I've done about 15 years of work on intervention programs, particularly for underrepresented groups. What we're finding is a lot of those interventions are kind of wraparound programs. They have a variety of activities, which may be academic enrichment components, it might be financial support, and then they also connect students with faculty in kind of research labs or undergraduate research kinds of opportunities. So the mentoring is somehow interwoven in all of that. So what we're finding is, for the intervention programs, the overall success of the program is what gets evaluated, but no one's quite sure what component of that program is more important, particularly what the performance is of mentorship. At one point, I think NIH, when we were doing these intervention studies, basically said, well, is it the money, or is it the mentorship in the research relationship, or is it the opportunity? It's like the question they wanted to know, and I thought, well, they're all wrapped up together, because sometimes the capacity to be able to earn and learn at the same time is a real attraction for an undergraduate to enter some undergraduate research program and also work with a particular faculty member. So it's really hard to kind of unravel these, and so for the most part we have not been able to in the research determine the differences or these different components in the program that are most important. But we know that a lot of programs have mentee groups or peer structures, right, where they have the peer mentoring occurring, which is really important. The step-ahead mentors in labs that include grad students, might include a postdoc, and also advanced peers as part of their mentoring group and their research group that they have. What's important is significant institutional support and also intentional design in terms of thinking about how to structure those relationships. So I'm going to talk more about the institution. My most recent work is really focused on case studies of institutions. So if we are able to, and we've done some national studies of all four-year institutions in terms of their productivity of underrepresented groups in STEM in particular, but also overall their performance to understand what's happening within the institution. As I said, NIH also invested heavily in this notion that mentorship is going to be possibly the silver bullet. I don't like to attach. I don't like silver bullet solutions at all because it's not the only thing. But they put a lot of their eggs in that one basket and saying this is going to be really important. So they invested in big ways to create the National Research Mentoring Network and create a series of R01 studies that are focused particularly on mentorship that are happening nationally now. The issue that I think that bedevils both NIH and also other funders like HHMI is basically they know when the funding goes away, will those same practices be institutionalized by the institution once that happens? So the question then has been broadly is, how are institutions beginning to adopt these quality mentorship and support systems that are without this external funding? In other words, to begin to develop them internally because it's the right thing to do and it is part of a broader learning and student success project that we want to enhance. So most of this then, the big questions are beginning to be is, because you can have these great relationships in certain spaces, but how do you actually improve it institution-wide? So I think that's the main question. And that happens also in teaching. So I think that for the most part, we're really beginning to talk about cultures of inclusive excellence. That is, thinking about really, what if we had an institution that had a culture that valued mentorship, rewarded it, and implemented, and actually held people accountable for having those good relationships. So that's the question. A big challenge, again, the challenge is the same with teaching and learning, is that there are challenges to address the barriers in terms of implementation. Time, resources, rewards and incentives, expertise, and then confidence to implement. That is, we can actually provide, like the report will provide, a lot of great evidence to help change people's minds. But to change behaviors, you also have to provide some ways to kind of develop the confidence to implement it. So again, very much parallel with teaching and learning issues. It's the same way with mentorship, is that, okay, how do I know what I'm doing wrong? I get it, I see the research, so what do we do next, right? So I think what's important is really to have some broader institutional commitment and leadership to support mentorship as something that is important to the quality of undergraduate and graduate education. So what do they do? What are some important things to do? Provide some mentorship education. Use mentorship tools. They are now available, and I'll give you a website for a lot of those. Encourage faculty and staff to share mentorship challenges, innovations, evidence with peers. Evaluate mentorship effectiveness with validated measures. One of the things that the National Research Mentorship Initiative is doing now is they have a library of measures that people can use to start to study mentorship in local contexts. And so we're in the middle of doing a whole range of things. I'm developing something on departmental climate to understand how that impacts mentorship and also mentor training, results of mentor training. So using data and research to hold broader conversations about mentorship activities and innovations, I think, is really key. So the report has about 9 recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of them have to do with institutional leadership, department chairs, mentors. So there's recommendations for everyone in this report. And then the final 2 are directed at funding agencies and also scholarship, to advance the scholarship in this area. And I'll just go through a couple of them. Using an evidence-based approach, I'm going to give you some of the resources for that. The importance of setting clear expectations, engaging in regular assessments, that's really important. And then for mentees to understand also their own rights and responsibilities in terms of some of this, to really understand that they can actually use some tools and engage in conversation with their mentors, develop their professional development plans. So establish structured feedback mechanisms to improve mentorship at all levels. And I think what we've done, we've gotten to the point where now documenting it, but we're not really doing enough in terms of feedback to understand that how do we improve, right? I think through the tools that I've used with my students that have been implemented to date, at first I thought, oh, most faculty said, oh, no, we don't need these. When they started using them, I started to learn some interesting things about my own students that I didn't realize. And I thought I knew them quite well, but when they talk about their needs and some of the things they wish that I would do, I begin to think about what is it I can do. And so I think I've felt that those tools have been effective. But then what's happened is then I don't have like the department chair or the dean or anybody telling me feedback on it. I mean, we do them, we turn them in. So I think we're beginning the steps toward that, but we're not really getting to the point of providing feedback and accountability, but we're actually having conversations about this. So multiple identities, as I said, one of the things that we're beginning to do is thinking about inclusive approaches in mentorship, active listening, working towards cultural responsiveness, moving beyond colorblindness. As I said, it's like students and mentors and faculty come in with their social identities, and it's part of the dynamics that happen. And there are other dynamics at work, imposter syndrome, a whole range of other things that happen as a result of difficult situations. So I'm not moving. There we go. Okay. So thinking about multiple mentorship structures, I showed you some of the structures that are important. I also want to say that as students progress, particularly in their career, they usually begin to understand that their different people can provide different kinds of mentorship for them. So recognizing that it's not just a one-on-one, but they probably have multiple people that they're going to and seeking mentorship for a variety of things in their career. I'm not sure why it's not moving. Okay. Rewards. This is a difficult one. Department chairs, we're thinking about using mentorship metrics for promotion and tenure. Right now at UC, we typically report who are our students and what they're doing. And if they're successful, that's judged to be an effective mentorship relationship. But we've got to do more than that, I think, in terms of really thinking about that in terms of the reward system. Okay. Oops. Oh. I don't know how to go back. I don't know how to go back to the last one. Sorry. Oh, shoot. It's almost 5, folks. Let's see. What do I do? Okay. Let me stop there. Okay. I'll give you the contact information in a little bit. Here's our online guide. And you can see the variety of things that are available. And I'm not going to show any more than this, but you can go on and hopefully can I go back? How do I go back one? The bottom one, okay. There we go, okay. To use our online guide, to read more, the report, just go to the NAP, National Academy Press. If you want to see what the National Research Mentoring Network is doing, they're doing amazing things. You can join the conversation. We're still rolling out the report and talking to a variety of groups about the report. And as I said, we're very excited because I think this is the first time all the comprehensive information has been put together in one report. And we think, hopefully, we're alerting more people that there are resources and mentorship is part of deepening our commitment. So thank you. Okay, how much time?
You can have questions if you'd like to make their way to the microphone.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's so fascinating. I'm really excited to see evidence-based approaches in mentorship being shared. But I was hoping, I don't know if you looked at this at all, if you could explain a little bit more about the negative effects, about what to look out for, maybe the impacts on students, and how we could potentially adjust for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, I will say that there hasn't been as many studies of the negative experiences in science, though we've documented a lot from students in terms of the reports of negative experiences. Not just, I would say, discriminatory or bias kinds of things that happen, but also a whole range of other kinds of things that are everything from, putting students to wash the glassware. That's not mentorship, that's undergraduate research. We know that those things happen. And so one of the things, this actually comes from the organizational behavior and human resource development literature, where they've actually documented both the reports and then also subsequent kinds of, depression, well-being, not able to achieve some of the career goals, et cetera, so that there is this. We, in the report, said we need to do much more in both documenting and also understanding long-term what those consequences are. So in other words, when we did our study of graduate students, there was a lot of issues of being excluded, not being introduced to other people, and the kinds of way that mentors will do to, meeting people in their discipline and being able to achieve the kinds of connections and resources that they need to further their career. And so there hasn't been as much documented within that specific discipline, but it really comes from the career development work. And so we have tons of references on this, but it's certainly an area that I think there are a couple of key people in the country that are starting to do some of this negative mentoring experience research. Thanks, Natasha.
Thank you so much for your doing this work. It's really important. My question is, I know that from some of the studies, the sort of entering mentoring idea, where the training is much more effective when there's a mentor with an active mentee. Have there been any studies where there is an analysis of the effectiveness of mentoring when there is a mentor that is both an active mentor and being a mentee at the same being a mentee at the same time?
Right. Actually, I can't recall one, so I think that's probably a new area to think about, because I think for a lot of the studies that we reviewed is that people were classified as one as of the other, but not really this kind of legacy thing, or also understanding that one could be in a mentee relationship at the same time that they are mentoring others. We have seen, and just in our NIH projects, is we have seen how, for example, I'll just use a quick example, and this is part of the case studies that we were doing, of students who were actually put into post-bac situations, right? And they were getting research experience and applying to graduate school, but then also required to mentor undergraduates because they had graduated already. Well, those people were under an incredible amount of stress because they were learning research for the first time. They hadn't gotten it as undergraduates. This was their chance to go to graduate school, particularly in the science fields, and they were asked to also then mentor undergraduates. It just sounded ideal post-bac, but it was not in real time ideal for the participants. So I'd have to see whether they had 5 years of funding for that part of the program. I wouldn't be surprised if they had decided to get rid of it or do something differently, because the expectations were too high for those people that were in this in-between phase. So thank you for asking that question.
Hi, thank you. So obviously you're focusing on STEM mentorship, either in the work you're familiar with or pointing laterally, arts, humanities, social sciences. Is your understanding that the sort of advice and structures and research you're doing in STEM is analogous across those other fields? If there are any significant differences that you're watching, can you tell us about that? And there's a second question about alt academic careers and whether academically oriented or alternative academically oriented trajectories are different in the.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that because we were charged to look for it in STEM, and we went out of it when we couldn't find things in particular areas, and we relied on the expertise of all the panel members. So we didn't do a thorough, I would say, disciplinary difference analysis, but I think certainly there's the opportunity to do so now that this report exists, because then that can be followed to pull the other literature for that. We generated 3 lit reviews where people went into the literature, and those are attached to the report, and that might actually be pulling for more of the disciplines. But at this point, I can't just tell you. The only thing I would say is that a lot of the things that are mentioned in STEM are not something that's foreign to any other discipline in terms of that relationship or the general information. We focus primarily in the research relationship component, because that's what the interests are of the National Academy. The second question was on
Alternative academic
Oh.
careers versus.
That's a very good question, because I think we find this quandary, particularly with graduate education, in that the focus has been certainly on research, obviously, but masters, it could be a variety of fields, and it poses a really difficult issue for the mentee that might decide to go to work for industry, for example, instead of an academic field. And so the only thing that I'm aware of is there's documented kinds of experiences of both exclusion, but also, I could say, a negative mentoring experience when those choices get made and they're not in line with what the faculty member had expected. So it's difficult, yeah. Other questions?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a graduate student right now, and I was wondering if any of these resources are in the report, if there was like specific recommendations for graduate students or students themselves, because a lot of it seems like you can try and incentivize the faculty or the department or whatever, but if you're in a department that doesn't value that or gets on board in that, what can students actually do to, because there's a mismatch in power and authority,
Right.
like what can we do actually, like as far as, helping facilitate these relationships and things like that, where there isn't necessarily a culture and stuff.
Great question, because the report focused on undergraduate and graduate students. And so for these resources, there are resources for mentees, and also the National Research Mentoring Network, there are resources for mentees. And one of the things in terms of recognizing your rights to a quality education is really to ask for that. And recognizing the power relationship, obviously. But I think one of the things is, because there are now mentoring tools, there are these contracts or agreements, but it would be great if you got like a department chair to agree to do this, because you want to have more equitable mentoring outcomes, right? And so the experiences are, the faculty know every every relationship is different, and there's a lot of variability in terms of the experiences graduate students get. So everyone mentions the problem, but they don't do anything about it. So if you have a solution you can pull from one of your the resources, try it, see if that works. But you can also begin to say, at least looking at the tools, you can say, let's have a conversation. I want to clarify the expectations. I mean, I appreciate that conversation without even having like a written document for us to lay that out. Let's clarify the expectations. And I really appreciate that opportunity, because then I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'm expecting things. And I expect, or I know, I think I know what you know, but I don't know until you say you don't know. In other words, I tell my students, you got to speak up or you got to ask the question, because I don't know what you don't know. And it's better for me to know that, and then we can work from there, and I can help with that. But it's like we don't have ESP, you know, working in a relationship. And sometimes there's even more of a mismatch, right, in terms of goals and other things. So I think just saying, I want to have us come with your mentor, or you consider a mentor, or also think about, you can have multiple mentors, not a single one, to really do different things. Maybe one is navigating the department. Another one would be for connections to a particular discipline or a job, particular career you have in mind, right? To have these different people. So think about that. Knowing that also your central relationship with, you know, advisor or mentor is really key to where you go. I had, for example, another faculty in another department, and we had some affinity with research, and then I ended up doing a postdoc with him later, but he wasn't my mentor. I think he was my mentor, and my advisor was sort of my advisor, but I learned some things from my advisor that I could not learn anywhere else. And so I have to say there were different kinds of mentors. So good luck. And definitely, yes, if there are links for you to go for mentees, and it doesn't matter if you're a graduate or undergraduate, that you can just go and see, and then see which ones are more applicable. So good luck. This is meant for you.
Thank you again for the excellent work you're doing. I'm wondering, are you aware of any study that looked into the fact that we have a large percentage of the faculty and graduate students in STEM, and maybe I shouldn't use the word large, but an X percentage are from international backgrounds? Mm-hmm. And how does that affect mentoring for URMs, and what additional interventions do we need to put in place?
Okay, that's a great question. I don't think that there's, as far as the matching idea, as I said, the research doesn't support either matching or not matching. In other words, people get different things from different relationships. And for example, a lot of the work has been done because there have been more women, particularly in certain fields, right, of science, that they also talk about that research on women has actually provided a lot more, because the numbers are a little bit higher than the most underrepresented groups in terms of understanding what people get from different relationships. So for the international faculty, I just want to say that every mentor has a capacity to do an extremely great job, and we have to recognize that. When it's not working, we have to really have, I think, some institutional supports to help us with that, because it becomes then just this dynamic that just doesn't work. And so we have to give the mentee an opportunity to be able to, without retaliation, to be able to talk about those issues, switch advisors if necessary, or find multiple mentors for a variety of things that have to happen. So it's not so much, I think, international faculty, particularly for students of color, for many programs, that's the connection, that's it, right? That's because there's so few of them, right? They don't always have the choice, and if they do have some kind of a choice, it's as our research has shown, it's usually based on very scant information. It's not knowing a lot about how this is going to work in the beginning, right? So I would say international faculty have the capacity to be fabulous mentors. And so we just need to make sure that we know about how that relationship is working in every case. So, but no particular study specifically on that I can recall that we looked at. So thank you for that question.
very much. It's very
Thank you.